Welcome to the workbench with Matt Easton. So this is not the same workbench that you guys have seen before, because if you've seen my previous video with a workbench in it, you will have seen it go bang. But the important thing is the sword ended up straight. So that old workbench gave its life it sacrificed itself for the benefit of an antique sword. That's a pretty good way to go. This is a new old workbench. I got a fairly old one off eBay just because they tend to be slightly better made than the modern ones. But anyway, enough about workbenches. That's not what you're here to see. Here is something you might be here to see. So this is a rather nice knife. Again, I obviously buy and sell antiques through Eastern Antique Arms, link below the video. Sometimes, in fact, let's be honest about it, very often things come to me that I think, I want to keep this. And this is one of those things. What is it, you might be thinking? Well, it looks like a hunting knife, I guess, to most of you. You can kind of tell the size of it based on my hand. It's about a 7 or 8 inch blade, I believe. And it's a very specific thing, actually. So there are a few giveaways as to telling you what it is. First of all, it's the curve of this grip. It's quite indicative, and the fact that it's made of antler. So that's the first thing to look out for. Characteristic end of tang button, nut, whatever you want to call it at the end there. Next thing, quite characteristic oval shape of guard. Next thing, and this is very noticeable and memorable, a catch that latches onto the side of the guard in this case. Some of them actually go through a hole in the guard, but this one latches onto the side of the guard. It's a little bit bent, so it actually doesn't catch very well, this one, but nevertheless, that's the intention of it. So it's essentially a leaf spring that catches onto the guard, or through the guard in some cases. A button to go either into a frog, or just to simply, if this sticks down behind a belt or inside your trousers, to stop it from sliding down and falling out. But it can go through a leather frog. A leather scabbard stitched up the back with a metal end on it. Now, what do all these things mean? They mean it is not an American bowie knife or bowie knife, it's a British bowie knife. Now, as I've talked about in previous videos, actually lots of bowie knives, let's take this out so you can see the blade. Lots of bowie knives were actually made in Britain anyway. They were made in Sheffield and by the thousand and shipped out to America. So many American bowie knives were actually British or English. This, however, it doesn't have any maker's markings on it left anymore, unfortunately. It may have done at some point, but the blade has been, well, it's been used. Let's put it like that. This is a specific style of bowie knife that was made for the British market, but specifically for the Anglo-Indian officer market, both for hunting and campaigning, and in some cases perhaps self-defense. So it is in essence an Anglo-Indian bowie knife, and some of them were made in India, some of them were made in Britain, but they were very popular things in India amongst the British kind of officer class and kind of gentry and hunting class, shall we say, from about 1860 to right the way through to the beginning of the 20th century. So this example probably dates to the end of the 19th century. It's probably 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, something like that. It's very difficult. They don't really change much in style, so it's very difficult to date them. Now, why is it on a workbench? Well, it's been used and it has been severely sharpened many times, so it's got grind marks all over the blade. That's no bad thing. But it's quite dirty and grotty, so I'm going to clean it up and I'm going to preserve it. I'm not going to do anything very brutal to it, but I'm essentially going to put it into a better condition than it is now. And I'm going to show you how I'm going to do that. So the very first thing I'm going to do is actually not to the knife at all. First thing that needs pretty urgent attention is the leather of this scabbard. It has got very light signs of damp mould on it. Mould will eat away leather. Little spots, telltale spots of mould damage on it. So it's been kept somewhere like a shed, I should imagine. So I'm going to treat that leather, and let's have a look at how I'm going to do that. So here's the first thing that I am going to treat the leather with, in fact the only thing I'm going to treat the leather with, and it's called dubbing. And it was used for all sorts of things. As you can see, it's got a Chelsea pensioner on the label. You can buy this off Amazon, eBay, basically loads of places. And it's used for all sorts of things. It's used for waterproofing and nourishing leather. Could be boots, saddles, anything made of leather at all really, but it's fantastic for scabbards, and it's probably quite similar to what was used in the Victorian period, and it has been around since the Victorian period. In fact it says on the tin since 1890, so there we go. 11 years of Queen Victoria's reign. I've got a couple of pots here. This one is nearly empty. But there's probably enough in the old one for our purposes. I've got a new one here just to show you what it looks like. It looks a bit like fat or tallow, and I believe that's predominantly what it is. Actually, it says, what does it say it's made of? It actually doesn't say. I've never bothered to look it up, but it's fine to get on your hands. There's nothing noxious or horrible about it, but it does look a bit like butter. But if you're not squeamish, actually, you can just apply this stuff like Vaseline with your finger. Sometimes use a cloth, but in this case, I'm just going to use my finger. And it is as simple as that. You just literally rub the stuff on, rub it all over the surface. And incidentally, what's very important about this, about dubbing in particular, is it's completely safe to get onto metal. And in actual fact, it will prevent rust and other kinds of corrosion to iron and steel. So it's pretty good in that sense. And also remember, what you don't want to be getting onto leather, or indeed wood or shark skin, shagreen, or anything like that, are oils that are intended for metals, because they're often quite harmful to organic materials. But if you put dubbin on the leather or the wood first, then it protects it from any subsequent oils you use to clean the metalwork, which is obviously really useful. It essentially coats it in this grease. And the nasty oil that is quite good for steel doesn't damage the leather, or at least not very easily. It doesn't damage leather anymore once you've stuck it on. So it's as simple as that. Incidentally, it does act a bit like moisturiser. I don't recommend that you apply it to your face unless you particularly want to look very shiny and smell a bit strange. But, you know, if you're into that, then go for it. I don't think it'll harm you. I don't know whether you can eat it, so don't try and ingest it unless you're really like starving to death or something like that. Anyway, so rubbing it all into the leather, and in theory, what you should do, what I say you should do anyway, I don't know what the official, whatever official is, advice, I'm probably about as official as it gets on this, but leave it to soak in for some time, because obviously at the moment it's just sitting on the surface of the leather. It will have penetrated a little bit, but you really want to get it deep in, because as you know, on this channel we love deep penetration, even when it's of something like this grease. So there we go, leave it for a while to soak in, and then once it has soaked in, you can then go and slap on another layer. I mean, you can't put too much, to be honest. And then once you've left it to soak in for a while, overnight, for a week, or just for a couple of hours, however long you like, once you've left it to soak in, then we'll see in a minute what you do next. Okay, so I've let this soak in for about 5 minutes, in fact, not very long at all. But, you know, you can already see the leather has gone black, it's gone dark. This dubbin is clear. You can, I believe, get coloured equivalents of this, which obviously if you want to return something to its original, what you think its original colour, if it's faded or whatever, that's something you could do, much like shoe polish. But I use clear dubbin. It does tend to make most things darker, so be warned, if you really like the colour of something it is now, dubbin will make it go darker, okay? That's just a warning. Obviously, if something's black, it doesn't make an awful lot of difference. Right, so what do we do next? We get a cloth, pretty much of any kind you want. I'm using an old bath towel, a relatively clean one, and you literally just rub the surface of the leather, being relatively careful, because obviously remember that this is 100-year-old leather. Now, and what's interesting is that takes all the greasiness off the surface, and it also sort of polishes it, kind of buffs it, much like when you have your shoes polished, if you have your shoes polished, which I don't, I have to hasten to mention. So buff, buff, buff. But essentially it makes it look, if not like new, much more like it was when it was new. But most importantly, it preserves it, and that's the thing here. We're not just making things look like new by, you know, like remaking them essentially, or like damaging them, destroying them. I'm an archaeologist by background, and so it's my kind of in my nature, I suppose, to want to preserve things. This does that. You know, I'm not just trying to make a knife that looks new here. What I'm trying to do is make sure it lasts for generations to come, and by feeding the leather, you're doing that. So I'm pretty happy with that. That's come out pretty nice. It looks lovely, in fact. Now, I don't know whether you'll be able to see on the camera. I don't know if it will really focus, but we've got some very nice decoration. I'm just trying to catch the light. Maybe you can see about there. You've got impressed decoration here and here. There clearly was some in the middle, but that's kind of rubbed away, unfortunately. But it's clear this was made quality. It's got sort of outlines here and here. This is a nice piece, and certainly worthy of a bit of effort. Right, so next we're going to clean the metal parts of the scabbard. Now, to do that, we're going to use wire wool or steel wool. This is an old bit. Obviously, it looks shiny when you get it out. I actually find, I'm not really sure why, but I find that wire wool seems to work better when it's been used for a bit and kind of got some oil soaked into it. New wire wool seems to be a bit scratchy, so I keep all these old bits of wire wool and I kind of mash them together. Wire wool, unfortunately, can get stuck in your skin, and I actually prefer, I'm going to put gloves on for this. I know lots of people will use wire wool without gloves on. It's not, I wouldn't call it a safety issue, but I really hate metal splinters. They're really nasty little things, and these, especially fine wire wool, you get just the tiniest bit of broken off wire wool under your skin, and it takes ages to get it out, and it can be really irritant. Also, and this is again personal experience, remember that when you use wire wool, little bits of wire fall off. So if you're doing it on a floor that you walk around on, hoover up afterwards, vacuum up, that's a British term, hoover, vacuum up, clean up afterwards, because there will be tiny little bits of metal wire, essentially, little broken bits of wire all over the floor where you've been working, and indeed on the worktop. You want to vacuum all of those up, clean those up, because number one, like I said, you don't like it, it's not nice getting into your skin. You certainly don't want it to get into your food and ingest it. It won't poison you or anything like that, it's only iron, but it might cause some kind of irritation in your mouth or something. But equally, and again, personal experience, I have walked on an area which had iron filings on, and I got one splinter from one of these things in my toe, and it took ages again to get it out. It's horrible stuff, but it's very effective at the job. Right, so let's stick some gloves on. Any old gloves will do. I've just got some old gardening gloves originally, I think, or I don't know, they're just kind of builder's gloves. I got them in France actually, and you just get your little bit of wire wool, go to as you can see here, there's some corrosion on that metal, and very simply just rub it. Now, when you're rubbing, I recommend, as much as possible, you move in circles. The reason being that fundamentally what you're doing with wire wool is you're scratching, okay? So this is on a minor level destructive, but it's destructive on a very minimal scale in order to remove corrosion, and the corrosion itself is destructive, so you're kind of fighting with fire to an extent. And because you're scratching the surface, if you move just backwards and forwards like this, you're going to end up with quite visible essentially scratching lines. It's the same with polishing, incidentally. So by moving in circles, instead you have more disguised scratches in the surface. You can, of course, buff with a buffing wheel, which I'm going to use a little bit later, this surface to make it really polished. I'm not going to do that on the Scabbard because I don't think the Scabbard ever would have been buffed up to be bright. I think it always would have been kind of satin finish, so that's what I'm going to take it to. Now what's interesting, well, not interesting to you probably because I doubt you'll be able to see it, but the metal parts of this knife have been covered in varnish at some point, which is why, incidentally, they're not completely dark. So you'll notice a lot of the antique swords and other weapons that I have in my videos are dark. And the reason for that is because iron and steel oxidize in the air. It's the reaction they have with just air. And they go dark, and especially if you touch them with your fingers, they go dark even quicker. But if you varnish a surface, you're essentially covering it in plastic. You protect it and you inhibit the ability for the steel to oxidize because it doesn't have access to oxygen. What's happened with these metal parts is they've been coated in some old varnish. You actually find it quite often on antique items. It seems to have been a way that people looked after some antique weapons in the past. But what happens is the plastic surface gets scratched over time, just in contact with objects, with wood, with anything else, because obviously the varnish isn't a very hard surface. And when it gets scratched, then it oxidizes. So what we've got here, the little bits of rust damage you can see are where the varnish has scratched off. Anyway, this is probably fairly boring for you to watch, so I'm going to switch off. I'm going to carry on doing this, and I'll switch the camera back on when I get to another bit that's worth talking about. So there we go. I've got the Scabbard to where I'm happy with it being. You know, it's not going to look new, and I don't want it to. But the leather is clean and fed. The metal parts of the Scabbard are now a lot cleaner than they were before, including that leaf spring at the back. It's all a lot brighter, cleaner, smooth. There's no corrosion that you can really feel on the surface. That horrible varnish has been taken off. What I'm going to do is, before I move on to the knife, I'm just going to slap on yet more dubbing. See if I can squeeze some more out of this pot, just simply because I only left it for 5 minutes before, and really I'd like a little bit more time of that dubbing getting soaked into that leather. So I'm going to put dubbing on again and then leave this for much longer this time, because obviously I won't be filming the Scabbard again. One thing I'll just say about these Scabbards on this particular type of Anglo-Indian bowie knife is they are wood-lined scabbards like a medieval sword scabbard, so that in there is wood. So it's actually a wooden scabbard with a leather covering on the outside, and they are very obviously made either locally or in Britain, inspired by Tulwar scabbards, Indian sword scabbards. And in fact, the nature of the leather on this and the style of the stitching makes me think that this is probably local Indian work, which would mean that the skin of the leather is probably donkey. Donkey skin was quite popular for scabbards in India, because of course Hindus don't like to kill cows and Muslims don't like to kill pigs, so hey, the donkeys get get all the attention. So there we go. I'm going to leave that to soak, but now let's move on to the actual knife itself. So I sort of consider, in terms of cleaning and restoration, there are essentially three elements to this particular hilt. There's the blade, obviously, there's the grip, which is antler, and there's the hilt fittings, which are steel. So what I'm actually going to do first is I'm going to put my attention on the blade, largely because I'm going to be wanting to hold the hilt parts. So there's not an awful lot of point cleaning those up until I've dealt with the blade first. Now the blade is in pretty nice condition. It's fairly bright, and being in a wood and leather scabbard has protected it fairly well. It is fairly sharp. I wouldn't say it's quite, no, it's not going to cut my finger sharp, but it comes to an edge. It has been honed many a time. So this edge is never going to be like a mirror finish because it's lost its surface to scratching from sharpening. But it is grubby. It's covered in kind of old greasy oil and a little bit of corrosion. So I'm going to clean that up. The first thing I'm going to do is exactly the same as the hilt parts. I'm going to put some attention to it with wire wool. But before that, I'm going to get our favourite WD-40. Now, many of you will know that I'm a big fan of Ballistol, and people ask me, what oil do you like, Matt? And I say, oh, my favourite oil is Ballistol, or I don't know how it's said, actually it's double L, Ballistol, Ballistol, I don't know. It's German anyway, and apparently you can eat and drink, not eat maybe, but drink this, and it's really not healthy for you, but it's really not harmful. And it says on the back you can use it for cars, bikes, boats, gloves, houses, fishes, tractors and guns and dogs. I don't know what you do to dogs with it, but anyway, it's German, and it, like many German things, it works really well. I have a German car now, I'm quite happy with it. Yeah, so that is my favourite oil without a shadow of a doubt. This is awesome, get some if you've got swords. However, it's expensive, so what I tend to do is I save the Ballistol for final coat and for sort of the really expensive stuff. And most of the stuff I do with cleaning and everything else, I do it with cheap ass WD-40 because it does the job. And fundamentally, if you're going to be spraying onto a knife and then cleaning this stuff off, it kind of doesn't matter what oil you use, so you may as well use a cheap one. So let's just stick, one last thing about dubbing, before I keep going on about dubbing, is put the top back on because it will dry out. Okay, so top's back on, dubbing out of the way. So first thing to do is get some WD-40, give it a shake, and spray some on the blade. There we go. You don't need to wear 2 gloves for this. I only use 1 glove usually for the WD-40, and then essentially work that oil in. Again, moving in circles all over the blade. Now, what I'm primarily doing at this point is actually cleaning the knife because it's got a lot of gunk on it, oily gunk that's built up inside that scabbard, or sheath in this case. I think theoretically we should always say sheath for a knife and scabbard for a sword, but I tend to say scabbard for everything because I'm mostly dealing with swords. And let's just move this here so you can see a bit what I'm... So just rubbing in circles, don't neglect the spine of the blade, and clean the thing off. Okay, once you've given it a good old clean over, try and get into the nooks and crannies, that is the little corners, take an old rag and just wipe it off. What you've done now is you've essentially cleaned the blade and you can see what you're working with. I have to say, this is actually a much cleaner blade than I thought it was. A lot of what I thought was corrosion was actually just gunk. So now let's have a little bit of a think about how we're going to treat this blade. I don't have the same method of cleaning, restoring for every single blade because every single blade is a little bit different. Not, you know, in terms of the blade itself. Has it got etching on it? Has it got a decorated blade? Is it a plain blade? That immediately changes how you deal with it. I would never personally be using wire wool on a surface that has got decoration on it, but this is a plain surface, okay? So I don't have to worry about that. Then, has it got corrosion on it? What type of corrosion? Is it active rust? Is it red rust? Is it old black rust? Or is it just patina? All of these different things you would treat slightly differently. And I have to be honest, there are some swords and knives that have a certain type of aging to them that I just look at them and I think, well, you know, I could try and polish that up, but it's not going to make it look better, and so I leave it as is. Sometimes it's better to just leave something because you're not going to increase its value or improve its appearance or indeed preserve it by trying to clean it. You're actually just going to highlight its imperfections. So sometimes it's better to leave a surface black if it's got lots of pitting, for example. If you have a blade that has rust pitting and you polish it, yes, you'll make the top surface shiny, but all of the recesses will be black, and so all you're doing is you're highlighting the fact that it has pitting. If you leave it dark, the pitting is less obvious, and actually aesthetically it's more acceptable. Right, okay, so let's have a little look at cleaning this particular blade and what strategy I'm going to use. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and feel free to follow us on Facebook.